He threatened my family. I'm not gonna let that go.
I can't allow you to kill Hector.
Hey everybody, and thank you for watching another video. My name is Merge, and welcome to the Breaking Bad What If series that I call the Heisenverse, a series where I make a change somewhere in the Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul timeline and see how that one change ripples throughout the entire universe. And in this video, we explore how far Mike would go if the Salamancas ever decided to go after his family, and what kind of impact on the universe it would have if he chose to pull the trigger when Gus told him not to. Well, that's what we're here to find out. And before we get started, if you could leave a like on this video to support the channel, I'd appreciate it. Now, let's get into it.
That all you got?
Get on the ground!
The sound of clattering keys can be heard as Mike enters through the front door of his house, and he walks with uncertainty down a dark hallway with his hand out against the walls to keep his balance until he makes it to the kitchen. And he finally turns on the lights and he drops an envelope full of money on his table. Money that was paid to him by Nacho for taking care of his Salamanca problem. And although he's not dead, which was the original deal, Tuco beating Mike in front of the police plus finding his fingerprints on a gun in the area, he's at least going away for 8 years. So as he pops open a can of cold beer, he'd also grab a bag of frozen carrots to put over his eye. And after a long day, he's finally able to take a seat and just relax. A couple days later, we pick up at a diner where Mike is having breakfast, but when he receives a visit from a man who introduces himself as Héctor Salamanca, he agrees that Tuco is a hothead, and jail may be the best place for him, but not for 8 years. And he makes an offer to Mike that if he were to say that the gun was his, he would give him $5,000, and to sweeten the deal, he'd also get Tuco to apologize to him. But instead of answering right then and there, Hector would pay his bill and just give him some time to think about it. But Mike, knowing the Salamanca's reputation, he sees this encounter as more of an attempt to try and scare him into taking the charge. So as Hector leaves the diner, Mike sits with the idea that now he has a Salamanca problem. And a few days later, when Mike arrives home from doing some grocery shopping, he sees a guy sitting on his front porch and looking to be waiting for him. And as Mike gets closer to the porch, he questions the man about what he wants, to which he tells Mike that he was sent by Hector because he's waiting for an answer. And Mike tells him that he respectfully declines, but the man assumes that Mike doesn't know about the Salamanca's reputation, and he asks, "Are you sure about that?" And Mike, in his usual fashion, stands firm on his answer and says, "I am." And with no other words spoken, the man calmly gets up and he leaves. But seeing that they already know where he lives, Mike knows that this will likely continue to persist, and he begins to take preventative measures to keep himself one step ahead of the Salamancas. And the very next day, Mike takes down 2 goons who broke into his house to try to get the message across for him to take the $5,000. But Mike once again refuses, and he tells them that if they're trying to scare him, they need to try harder, which Hector takes as a personal challenge because he would send the twins out to deliver a more direct message. And one afternoon while playing with Kaylee at a hotel pool, Mike spots the brothers on a rooftop making gun gestures at both him and his granddaughter, which crosses the line for Mike, because when it was just him, that was fine because he knew the risk, but involving his family is something that he cannot let go any further. So later that night, Mike arranges a meeting with the Salamancas at a taco shop to discuss how they're going to put it into this. And after Hector tells Mike the plan for the DA, Mike would change the subject to the topic of payment, demanding $50,000 for doing this. But Hector shuts him down, telling him that he's in no position to negotiate, and he offers him the payment of getting to live. But when that's not enough for Mike, he tells him while clutching his gun and getting everyone ready for a shootout. Either I get my money, or none of us are walking out of here. And seeing that he's willing to die for this money as well as having the balls to even try to go head to head with him, Hector smiles while nodding in approval, and he agrees to give him the $50,000 to take the gun charge. A few days go by, and even though Mike's gotten his money from Hector, the fact that he threatened his family is just something that Mike can't let go. And he decides to do some recon to get to know the Salamanca's operation a little better. And only after a few nights, he'd find out the trucks they use, where they go to unload, as well as where they stash their money. And with the help of a water hose and a couple of nails, Mike's able to ambush one of the Salamanca's drivers who just so happened to be making a delivery today. And he easily hogties the man without being seen or heard, and while using a power saw, he cuts open the tire that holds $250,000. But what Mike doesn't notice is that because of how sweaty the man was, a part of the tape that was covering his eyes became loose enough for him to drag his head against the ground and lifting the tape up just enough to get a clear look at Mike, who he sees robbing the truck without his mask on. And in a matter of minutes, Mike would throw the money in the back of the trunk and he drives away, leaving the driver tied up and expecting for the police to come and get him. But instead of the cops coming, a couple hours later, the driver would be rescued by a good Samaritan who would later be killed by Hector. And when questioning the driver, he tells him all about the old bald gringo that he's seen robbing the truck, and this upsets Hector to the point that he almost has a stroke, because the Salamancas only know one person fitting that description. And he gives the orders to Nacho and Arturo to go get his money back. And as far as Mike goes, Hector sees him as a man that's looking for death, and he's not about to give him what he wants, yet. Instead, he'd send his 2 nephews to pay a certain hotel room a visit. The next day rolls around and we pick up at a courthouse ticketing booth where Mike's been working all morning and afternoon, just like any other day. But when he received a phone call from a hotel manager where his daughter-in-law is staying at, a somber-toned voice on the other end of the line tells him, "Hello, am I speaking with a Mr. Michael Ermintrout?" "Yes, this is he," Mike says calmly. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but there's been an incident on the property involving the 2 guests that were staying in the room that you rented," the manager explains. "An incident? What kind of incident? What are you talking about?" Mike questions. "Well, there was a shooting and it might just be better if you just come down here and have the police explain it to you," the manager says before the line disconnects. And Mike doesn't hesitate for a moment before leaving his post and driving as quick as he can over to the hotel. And while driving, he also tries to call his daughter-in-law Stacy, but every call he makes would ring twice and gets forwarded straight to voicemail, which is odd, but he just keeps trying until he makes it to the hotel. And despite all the police in the area, Mike recklessly pulls into the nearest parking space before jumping out the car and seeing the countless police officers going in and out of the taped-off hotel room. And as Mike is making his way past the officers to ask what's going on, in almost slow motion, as one of the officers try to talk Mike down and restrain him from going inside, his heart begins to beat so loud that it's all he can hear. And when the police are talking to him, Mike's attention goes everywhere else, from noticing the bullet holes in the walls nearby to seeing one of Kaylee's drawings with blood smeared on it. And the officer snaps him out of his trance while handing him a card and saying, "And if you have any questions, please give me a call." And as Mike takes the card, he and the officer steps to the side as the medical examiners leave the hotel room and slowly wheeling out 2 stretchers that have a body bag on each of them. And Mike watches as the ambulance drives away with the bodies of his daughter-in-law and his granddaughter. And it forces him to come to grips with the fact that although he didn't pull the trigger, it was him that got his family killed. Because when you're in the game, nobody's off limits, not even children. And as Mike makes it back into his car, he goes into his glove box to grab his alcohol flask. But before he can even take a sip, he receives a phone call from his daughter-in-law's phone, and he has a pretty good idea on who's on the other line. So as he answers, Mike will hear the sound of Hector's raspy voice on the line telling him, "This is the price you pay for interfering with Salamanca business. And if you continue, things can always get worse, even when you think you have nothing to lose." And with that, the line disconnects and leaving Mike, who's still sitting in the hotel parking lot with nothing but his thoughts and a flask full of alcohol. Over at the Salamanca warehouse, Hector sits while continuously striking a lighter, and with him due to having a meeting with Bolsa and Eladio in a few days, the last thing he wants is to come at them with is an excuse. And the thought of being robbed by this nobody is something that he's having a hard time letting go. And he calls Nacho to tell him that there's been a change of plans, and he orders him and Arturo to bring Mike to him because he wants to take care of this personally. And after Nacho agrees, the call ends. But him knowing Mike, and more importantly what Hector took away from him, the last thing he wants to do is be anywhere near him right now. But without much of a choice, while him and Arturo head over to Mike's house, Nacho's able to sneakily send Mike a warning text. Later that evening, Mike pulls up to his house slightly drunk, and while dragging his feet up to his front porch, he's able to recognize that his house was again broken into. And while tracing his finger around the damaged lock, he slowly begins to boil with rage at the fact that someone picked a day of all days to burglarize his house, especially if it is who he thinks it is. So as Mike enters the house with his gun at the ready, he goes to turn on the TV to get his attackers to lower their guard. And one by one, he sees him walk out the bathroom and he's able to kick the door, knocking one of his attackers off balance while knocking the other to the ground with the butt of his gun. But when he faces the other attacker and seeing that it's Nacho, they share a moment of silence before Mike looks down at Arturo and presses the gun to the back of his head and he pulls the trigger. He then turns on the lights and points the gun at Nacho, and then he asks, "Did you know?" "No, I swear to you. If I did, I would have warned you like I did before we came," Nacho says with his hands up, and Mike goes into his pocket to check his phone because he didn't see the message, and he asks while lowering the gun, "So this was Salamanca's plan, sending the B team to take me out?" And Nacho tells him, "We were just told to bring you to him." Mike scoffs at Nacho while looking down at Arturo, who's bleeding all over his floor, and he questions him saying, "So, is that still the plan? Look, if it's not me that's going to bring you in, and I'm not saying that I am, but they will find someone else to do it. But with that being said, as far as I know, we showed up to your house and you weren't here," Nacho explains. "And what about him? I'm sure your boss is going to notice when he's a guy short." Mike questions as he gestures to the body that lies between them. And Nacho tells him, "The story will go that we waited at your house, but you never came. He got into his car, I got into mine, and we both went our separate ways. And after that, who knows what could have happened? We have a lot of enemies, so it could have been anybody." And given their relationship, they both have a common trust between each other, knowing their business outside of all this. And with them having a similar hatred for the Salamancas, Nacho lets Mike know that tomorrow morning they're expected to meet with Hector out in the desert. And with that bit of information, Mike has everything he needs to get a head start on the Salamancas. And knowing that there's going to be more people coming to try to kill him, he knows he has to move fast. So after him and Nacho go their separate ways, Mike would go into his floorboard stash spot and grab the money, guns, and a framed photo of his granddaughter. So while he casually steps over Arturo's body, Mike walks out the front door with no intentions of coming back. And over at Nacho's house, he stands in front of the safe putting money inside trying to keep calm, but his hands hasn't stopped shaking since leaving Mike's house. Because if anyone ever found out about their business together, he's dead right along with them. So in order to keep everything according to plan, he calls Hector and tells him that him and Arturo are still waiting outside Mike's house, but he hasn't showed up yet. And to avoid suspicion with Hector, Nacho suggests that Arturo would keep staking out at Mike's house while he gets a hold of the driver and they can all meet up in the morning. And when Hector agrees, Nacho is finally able to calm down because now he has a story for Arturo. But his other problem would be what happens after Mike kills the Salamancas. Or worse, what if he can't? And he picks up the fake IDs from his safe and he looks at them with a pained expression, because either way, he can't stick around after tomorrow. And if his father doesn't come with him, who knows what could happen. Early the very next day, Mike wakes up inside his car that's been parked across the street from his daughter-in-law's house. And as much as he'd like to believe that yesterday was all just a bad dream, when he goes to get coffee at a nearby diner, he notices that Arturo's blood is still on his sleeve, confirming that this is all very real. And as his emotions start to flood back in, as hard as it may be, Mike is able to bottle up his grief and focus on the job at hand. So as he makes his way over to the desert location where Nacho said they'd be, he has no idea that a tracker's been placed on his car. And as much as he'd like to think that he's one step ahead of the Salamancas, there's somebody out there that's at least 10 steps ahead of him. So as Mike spends the next few minutes getting into position by setting up his rifle and adjusting his scope, while he waits for his shot, he would hear the sound of a horn going off behind him. And he gets up to see what's going on, only for him to find a branch that's wedged between the front seat and the horn, as well as a letter on the windshield that simply says the word, "Don't." And he looks around for a moment with his gun drawn, but there's nobody there. And while looking back at the letter, he takes it as a warning that somebody's watching him and that person doesn't want him to kill Hector. But if this person's defending people like the Salamancas, that's not someone he wants to listen to. And he crumbles up the paper and he goes to get back into position. And only a few miles away, Nacho's driving over to meet with Hector with the driver tied up in the back of his van. And when he makes it out to the little house in the desert, Hector would ask about Arturo, and Nacho lets him know that he hasn't heard a thing from him since last night, but he volunteers to leave and go find him right now. But Hector tells him to stay behind because he's going to be the one to dig the grave for the driver, and when they're done here, he can ride with the twins to go find him as well as the bald gringo. But for now, the attention is directed towards the tied up driver that's squirming on the floor, and Hector and Nacho watches as the twins drag the man outside. And as they walk out the door to watch the execution, Mike moves his finger to the trigger as he continues to wait for his shot. And when seeing Hector walk out the door, Nacho would be the only thing saving him from a bullet to the head. But seeing the twins getting ready to shoot the driver, Mike, while aiming at Nacho, makes a split-second decision, and he fires at the same time Lionel does. And while the driver falls backwards into the hole, the twins turn around and watch as both Hector and Nacho fall to the ground as well. And out of nowhere, another shot is fired, dropping Lionel right by his brother's side. And Marco avoids gunfire by quickly going to take cover inside the house, and he presses against the wall of the home to try to see where the shots are coming from. And he glances down at his uncle, who took a shot to the neck with a bullet that came through Nacho's chest and leaving them both dead and bleeding out on the desert sand. And as Mike is looking through his scope trying to get his last target, he'd be so preoccupied that he wouldn't even notice someone creeping up right behind him. And by the time he does hear something, it'll be too late, because the moment he turns around, he's knocked unconscious and tied up and put in the back of a truck. And we come to find out that that someone was Victor. It's now the middle of the night, and Mike awakens to find himself surrounded by Gus, Bolsa, Lionel, and a few other men at a warehouse parking lot. And Gus does his best to hide his frustration from being both robbed of his revenge, as well as being forced to hand over Mike to the cartel. Because if he didn't, Bolsa would have thought that this was Gus's plan, considering the history between him and Hector. And Bolsa approaches Mike and he tells him calmly, "Mr. Ermintrout, tonight, you are going to die. But before that happens, I need to know why. Why would you go after the Salamancas?" And Mike takes a few deep breaths while looking at the ground before looking up at Bolsa and telling him, "You want to know why I killed Salamanca?" Mike says while spitting some blood out before he continues, "I know you guys have a saying in Spanish, and I believe the English translation means blood for blood. Salamanca went after my family, so I went after his. My only regret is I couldn't kill them all." Mike says while looking over at Marco with a look of disgust on his face. But after Mike's explanation, Bolsa calls Marco over in Spanish, and he basically gives him permission to finish him off. And for the next few minutes, Marco with his own hands would beat Mike to a bloody pulp. And with his arms tied up behind his back, all he can do is take it. And as he lies on the ground gasping for air, Marco pulls out a knife and stabs Mike so many times that when he's done, the blood would stain the pavement. And while the men take care of Mike's body, Bolsa and Gus would talk about who's going to fill in the void left behind by Hector, because when the news of his death begins to echo in the streets, it's only a matter of time before the competition starts creeping in on the Salamanca territory. So until further notice, Gus would handle things on this side of the border until they could find a replacement for Hector, and in many ways giving Gus the freedom that he always needed to begin his next project. And in the coming weeks, Gus does a more hands-on approach with finding an engineer for the job, and it leads him to working with an all-German crew led by a man named Werner Ziegler. And he puts Tyrus in charge of the project to keep the guys in line. But without the understanding and hospitality that Mike would have provided, it'll be all business with Tyrus. So no alcohol, no strip clubs, and no R&R. Just rest and work. But it'll only be a matter of time before they get tired of the same routine. After about a month or so, over at the Los Pollos Hermanos restaurant, a man approaches Gus with a warm, friendly smile, and he introduces himself as Lalo Salamanca. And as the two begin to talk inside Gus's office, Lalo would thank Gus for letting Marco have revenge for the Salamanca name. And with a smile, he tells Gus that he's going to be seeing a lot more of him from now on because he's going to be taking over the Salamanca territory. And Gus would put on a corporate smile before shaking Lalo's hand and letting him know that if he needs anything, not to hesitate to ask. And after joking about how tasty the chicken is, Lalo leaves Gus's office on a friendly note. But he, like everyone else, knows how Hector feels about Gus, and despite the fact that he just met the man, Lalo would share the same hatred for him as his uncle. And for the next few days, even weeks, he'd keep a watchful eye on Gus's operation for anything out of the ordinary. And one afternoon when there's a sudden commotion at the chicken farm, Lalo spots a black SUV picking up some guys over there. And he quickly packs up his things to get ready to follow them. But the reason for all this commotion is because of the time bomb that is Warner Ziegler, who snuck away to spend the weekend with his wife. And Tyrus would have the foresight to check the travel wire for any money transfers, but he wouldn't have the resourcefulness or the charisma to get behind the counter with Fred to view the tape like Mike would have. But you know who does? Lalo Salamanca. And after Tyrus leaves the travel wire, Lalo would kill Fred and he's able to view the tape himself. And before he leaves, he would take a few brochures to nearby resorts and start making phone calls to look for a man named Warner Ziegler. We pick up poolside where Ziegler's sunbathing at a resort with a towel over his face, but when one of the employees calls him over to the phone, he'd answer expecting it to be his wife, but instead he hears the voice of Lalo on the phone who tells him to stay exactly where he is because Gus is furious with him. And as Ziegler tries to apologize while also addressing the south wall, Lalo cuts him off and tells him, Warner, save your breath, don't worry, we'll talk. You just get ready, I'm on my way to you right now. Lalo says hanging up as he speeds over to the resort. Over at the chicken farm, Tyrus and Gus has everyone on the lookout for Ziegler. He even has a few guys at the airport waiting for his wife to arrive. But the longer they wait to find him, the more on edge Gus becomes. And when he gets word that Ziegler was checked into a resort but is currently not on the property, he has Tyrus go and watch the area until he can get him back. And in the meantime, just as a contingency, Gus will have Victor and a handful of his men watch the rest of the engineers to make sure there's not another escape. So as Gus looks down at his phone expecting an update from his men, he receives an unexpected phone call from Don Eladio personally. And he just tells him that he's needed in Mexico and he gives him 4 hours to be there. And before Gus can even ask why, the line disconnects, leaving Gus confused as to why a meeting is called with such short notice. But with this being orders from the top Don, he would just take the drive down to Mexico. And with his guys taking care of Ziegler as well as the crew, Gus feels that he has all of his bases covered. But over in Mexico, when Don Eladio gets off the phone, he sits puffing on a cigar with Lalo and Bolsa. And as they listen to Ziegler's story about Gus's plan for this super lab, Lalo was the only one with a smile on his face, knowing exactly what this means for the chicken man, and more so knowing that his uncle Hector was right all along about him. It's been exactly 4 hours, and after a long drive across the border, Gus finally arrives at Don Eladio's compound, and once he would search for weapons, he'd be escorted to the back near the pool. And as he turns the corner, he would see Don Eladio, Lalo, Marco Salamanca, and Juan Bolsa all sitting down waiting for him. It's only until he gets closer when his attention is drawn towards the pool where he sees something or someone floating face down inside of it. But this is the cartel, so dead bodies aren't exactly a rarity on this side of the border. And after Gus greets everybody, Don Eladio tells him in Spanish, Gustavo, by any chance, did you lose something? And Gus has a look of confusion on his face before asking what he means. But Lalo speaks up saying, oh, maybe I can help you out with that. And as he stands up and walks towards the pool, he grabs the person floating in the water and revealing it to be Warner Ziegler with a bullet in the middle of his head. So besides from the bullet and the water damage, I think you might recognize our German friend here. Lalo says never once letting a smile fade. And Gus seeing Warner dead at the hands of the cartel makes him visibly nervous, mainly because he didn't plan for this contingency. And after staring for a few minutes, Bolsa would tell Gus that he needs to respond, and he repeats the question asking, do you know this man Gustavo? And Gus finally figures out why this meeting was called, and he would imagine that Ziegler most likely told them everything, and that's why he's dead in the pool right now. And if they're going to kill him anyway, he might as well just get some things off his chest, and he tells them, whatever this man told you was the truth. Yes, I wanted to go out on my own because I couldn't stand working with you pigs any longer. It was always going to end this way anyway. Either I killed you, or you killed me. Blah, blah, blah. Lalo says after pulling the trigger and shooting Gus in the back of the head. And as his body falls to the ground, Eladio puffs on his cigar and then tells Lalo, congratulations. Frank's territory is now Salamanca territory. Do with it as you wish. And Lalo smiles because from that night on, him and Marco would go around Albuquerque and literally burning Gus's name to the ground, from his home to the laundromat, and of course the Los Pollos Hermanos restaurant. It all goes up in flames. And for the next few months, Lalo is basically untouchable. From the streets to the police, nobody can even come close to him. And because of this, he never crossed paths with Saul Goodman for his legal counsel, which allows for the D-Day plans to go off without any issues. And after Howard embarrasses himself during a hearing, it speeds up the Sandpiper settlement process at the cost of his reputation. But it wouldn't matter to Kim or Jimmy, thinking that someone like Howard would surely bounce back from this. And even when he stops by their house to confront them, his threat of exposing them is not taken seriously at all, not even by Howard himself. And besides, now that they have their money, Howard will be the last person on their minds, and they would spend the next few months getting established at their respective practices, all while Howard would have his hands full trying to repair his firm's reputation. It's been nearly a year since the death of Gus Fring and the rise of the Salamancas, and this takes us into the Breaking Bad side of things. And just to fill in some gaps in this timeline, let's talk about Crazy 8. He's dead. Because when he got arrested for the drugs that were stuck in the pipe, there would be no one there to vouch for him. And for Lalo, it's a lot easier to have him killed in prison than to trust that he's going to keep quiet. And when Tuco gets released from prison, he'd be the main person of contact for anyone trying to buy or sell in the South Valley. And with the help of Skinny Pete, he was able to arrange a meeting with Jesse and Tuco that would end with Jesse being robbed for £2 and beat to the point that he's sent to a hospital. And even though distribution's not Walter's area, he finds the courage to go out and face Tuco to get back what's his. And with some fulminated mercury, they would come to an understanding and start doing business together. But only after a few deals, Tuco would lose his temper and beat No-Dos to death right in front of Walter and Jesse.
Oh! Damn, man, look at that, look!
And in the following days, when Gonzo suddenly disappears and Tuco's place gets raided, the paranoia gets to him and he ends up kidnapping both Walter and Jesse because the plans that he has in store for them doesn't involve being on this side of the border. After hours of being locked in the back of a trunk, Walter and Jesse are blinded by the sunlight when it's opened up by Tuco, who's aiming a rifle right at him. And after he pulls them out the trunk, he walks them into the house where the sound of music can be heard from the outside. And when they enter, they see Lalo cooking and singing along to the music as he sets plates down at the table. And noticing that he has company, he turns the music down and introduces himself to Walter and Jesse with a warm smile while offering them some food. And his hospitality catches them off guard in comparison to Tuco. And as they eat, Lalo would ask, "Is it good? I hope you like spicy." It's delicious, thank you," Walter says, and Jesse says in agreement, "Yeah, it's the bomb, yo." And Tuco pulls Lalo to the side and he lets him know what's going on back home with Gonzo and the raids. And when he sees that they're finished eating, Tuco has them empty their pockets with Lalo asking them, "So, what makes you two so special that Tuco brought you way the hell out here?" And Walter tells him nervously while clearing his throat, we're the cooks." And as he throws the baggie of rice and meth on the table, Jesse speaks up saying, "Yeah, yo, and that Scante right there, that's our new product that we're working on." "Oh, really?" Lalo says while Tuco picks it up to smell it. And as Walter listens to Jesse talk about the new product, he starts to think that Tuco will actually go for it. But as soon as he brings up chili powder as the secret ingredient, he looks at Jesse like he was crazy before watching Tuco drop the baggie on the table. But Lalo, being intrigued, would say with a smile, "Wow, man, you're really selling it. I'll tell you what, Tuco may not like chili powder, but I do. And if it's as good as you say it is, how about you take the first bump?" He says, gesturing to the bag on the table. And Jesse quickly makes an excuse saying, "Yeah, I don't mind. I just usually wait like an hour after eating before I start back up, you know?" But Lalo would slide the baggie in front of Jesse and he tells him, "I said, hit it." And his smile disappears, now showing the similarities of that Salamanca temper. And as Jesse nervously gets ready to take a bump, Walter interjects saying to Lalo, "Maybe now is not the best time to get high if we're going to be leaving soon." And Tuco and Lalo stare at Walter before they both burst out laughing, with Tuco saying, "Heisenverse says now is not the best time to get high. It's always time to get high. Now hit it." And right as Jesse's about to take the bump, a news broadcast pops up showing Gonzo's face all over the TV. And the reporter says that he bled out from his arm being crushed by the surrounding vehicles, likely as an attempt to retrieve No-Dos' body, as he sees both their faces on TV now. And it confirms to Lalo and Tuco that it wasn't their men that told, which can only mean that it has to either be Walter or Jesse, at least in their eyes. And Tuco starts to do his lie detector on Walter as he looks him in the eyes before saying, "Can I trust you?" And Walter looks right back at Tuco, saying without breaking eye contact, "Yes. Yes, you can." And by process of elimination, Tuco looks at Jesse, who's denying to have said anything to the cops. And the next thing he knows, he's being thrown out the house, having his body hit the door before he lands on the ground. And Lalo tells Walter jokingly as he eats, "Hey, you go ahead and enjoy the show. Just watch out for stray bullets when he starts shooting, okay?" So as Walter goes outside to try to talk Tuco down, Lalo would stay inside eating and watching TV. But only after a few minutes, he hears a gunshot goes off and he imagines that Tuco just killed Jesse. But when a few more minutes pass and he notices how quiet it is outside, he goes to investigate to see what's going on. And right away, he sees that Walter and Jesse are nowhere to be found. And when he calls out for Tuco, he finds him dead in a hole with a bullet right between the eyes. And to make matters worse, a random SUV pulls right up to Lalo and he comes face to face with Hank, who thinks he just found Jesse, and he tells him, "Jesse Pinkman, you're a hard man to find," he says, closing his door. And with Walter and Jesse hiding out, they watch from behind Lalo as he starts to walk towards Hank. But when Walter spots a gun in the back of Lalo's waistline, he thinks of a way that he can save his brother-in-law. Then cutting back over to Hank and Lalo, he tells him while pretending to be Jesse as he walks towards him. "So, what can I help you with, officer?" It's Special Agent, and that's far enough. Hank says sternly while sizing up Lalo. Then cutting back over to Jesse and Walter, when he sees that Lalo's going for his gun, Walter just gets up and yells for Hank. "Hank! He's got a gun!" And both Hank and Lalo would go for their weapons, each getting a shot off and landing a hit on the other. But where Hank was hitting the leg, he was a lot quicker on the draw and getting Lalo with a headshot. And as Hank grips his wound to stop the bleeding, he looks out to see Walter standing in the distance, and he calls out for him like he can't believe his eyes. Walt? And Walter stands looking back at Hank as he whispers down to Jesse, who's still lying on the ground. "Jesse, just run." And he looks up at Walter for a moment, who gives him a knowing look, and then he just makes a run for it. And as Walter begins to walk towards Hank with his hands up, he just imagines what could have happened if he stayed on this path. Who else would have gotten hurt because of him? And as he comes to accept the consequences for his actions, he stands in front of Hank, who's still clutching at his wound. He tells him in a defeated tone, "Hank, I can explain." Hey everybody, and thank you so much for watching this video, and I really hope you enjoyed another story from the Heisenverse. And I know people may be asking for a part 2 to this one, but I don't really think there's that much more story to tell. Especially with Walter more than likely going to prison, all we have left is Jesse, Hank, Saul, and one half of the Salamanca twins. And maybe Marco would go after Hank, but remember, in the original, it was Gus that gave them permission. And for Jesse, I'm sure he'd be able to come up with an alibi that puts him in the clear. With the help of Wendy, of course. And after that, that'll be it. But that's just me. But now I want to hear from you guys. What do you think of this story? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Whatever it is, let me know down below in the comments. And also, if you think there should be a part 2 of this story, comment down below what it will be about, and maybe I'll even consider making it. But until then, my name is Merge. Later.